Hey everybody, OperationZ here, and we're picking up where we left off in Joseph's story, and we're on part 12 now. And in part 11, basically, the chief butler and chief baker have this dream, each one of them, and they kind of have the same type of meaning because they're both fate dreams, and it's just gnawing on them, and they're of a sad countenance and all that stuff, right? And they tell Joseph about it, and Joseph says, well, don't interpretations belong to God? What were your dreams? Tell me, and then I will tell you the interpretation and the meaning of the dreams that you've had. And the butler tells his dream to Joseph, and it gives indications of, pretty much just flourishing, and the three branches symbolize 3 days, and then there was budding, and pretty much the fruitfulness and all these things that were coming from the vine and the branches, and all these things that we had, like all these things that he had in his dream, flourishing, and it was positive and optimistic meanings that Joseph picked up on in the interpretation of the chief butler's dream. And, pretty much he interpreted his dream, and he just lets him know within 3 days everything's going to be okay, because he gave the cup when he squeezed the grapes into Pharaoh's hand in the dream. Pharaoh took the cup, and there was peace. There wasn't no strife. There wasn't no, the negative end of chaos type stuff going on, right? So pretty much it was all good. And he woke up, but he didn't know what it meant. He was troubled, and Joseph told him, your dream means in 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head, and you'll be restored your butlership, and you'll go about your business as usual. And he says, okay, I've eased your sorrows and your internal suffering and struggles that you're going through. Just keep me in mind here. I gave you the interpretation of your dream, and it was a good interpretation. Keep me in mind, because I'm in this prison, and I didn't even do anything wrong, and I ended up in this country. I didn't do anything wrong. And that's just that Joseph did not. He was an innocent person going into Egypt, and in Potiphar's domain, and in his property and his household. He did no wrong there either, and he ended up in prison. And he said, just remember me and speak these words, just mention me to Pharaoh. One simple little thing. And the chief butler, of course, doesn't, which it doesn't say that here. That's a little bit ahead. But I'm just going to go on ahead and say it now that he doesn't. And one of the reasons he probably doesn't, too, come to think of it, is, Pharaoh, they didn't want to risk, making him mad or annoying him or anything like that, because, he was pretty much just that big king there. And, pretty much he was already in trouble with Pharaoh and sent to prison there with Joseph. And Joseph had them both, the chief butler and the chief baker, in their charge. And, they didn't want to, or not they, but the chief butler, just didn't want to take any risks or any chances with the guy he already ticked off. And that's his mindset for why, when we really think about it, that's why he didn't tell Pharaoh. More than likely that's the reasoning behind it. Not just that, oh, well, I don't care about this Semite slave, which it could have been that too. He could have had that type of demeanor about it. But at the same time, even if he didn't, he's thinking he's restored to his butlership. Why would he want to stick his neck out for somebody else? And that's his mindset and state, just his state of mind in that, which would have been good for him to do that, especially after Joseph helped him out. And a little reciprocation could have been much appreciated, and it could have got Joseph out of there, and he could have been his own man in Egypt. He could have done all kinds of things in the land of Egypt there, or he could have left as a free man and made the journey back to his father, though he probably wouldn't have done that, being too weary and afraid of all of his brothers in that case. But, it wasn't God's plan that would happen anyway, because God had a bigger and better plan for Joseph's life. That's what Joseph wanted to do. He was just looking to get free, but that was Joseph's plan. But God's big plan for him, and we all do this sometimes, we try to make all the plans and we think, oh, it's this way and it's this way and it's this way, right? And God basically eventually shows you and shows us that no, it was actually something a lot better than you thought it was. And that can happen for all of us. And it's just something that, it's incredible what God has for his people, and it's incredible what God can do. Like in this case here with Joseph, God's plan was way better, mind-blowing, and he gets pretty much, everything turns around, and all his worries and his toils and his battles that he faced in the land of Egypt just melted away at that point. But we're going to continue where we left off here in verse 16. And Genesis chapter 40 verse 16 says this: When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, he said unto Joseph, I also was in my dream, and behold, I had 3 white baskets on my head. So he was in his dream, he was in the dream realm, so to say. And he said, I also had this dream, and 3 white baskets were upon my head. And so we know from his dream there was the vine and then the 3 branches from the chief butler's dream. And when we look at it like that, right, that symbolized 3 days. So here again, with this dream of this baker who may or may not have had a very different fate than the butler, yet within 3 days, 3 white baskets and so forth. That's where we're at so far. We just know something's going to happen with him in 3 days too that determines his fate. Like, these were fate dreams, both of theirs. That's why they gnawed at him so much, because they were so intense, like on their psyches and on their subconscious mind, just at a deep level, and that's why they were so troubled by him, because they knew that it meant something. Deep down they knew. And 3 white baskets on my head, says the baker. And Genesis chapter 40 verse 17, and in the uppermost basket there was of all manner of bake meats for Pharaoh, and the birds did eat them out of the basket upon my head. So this is very different from the flourishing, totally good symbolisms of the chief butler's dream. And it's interesting to note too that pretty much what they do day in and day out every single day has a meaning for their dream too, that's also part of their dreams. The butler, pretty much the biggest thing that he knows and does every day is butlership, so he had a butler's dream. And then the baker, of course, he's going to dream about bread and whatnot because it's a, a baker related dream. But it's more than just that, just because that's what they do every day. It also had to do specifically with butlership towards Pharaoh and being a chief baker towards the king of Egypt as well. So, that's very noteworthy here, very important to take in. But look at how negative it is, where the chief butler's dream was a positive, very good sort of dream realm omen, right? But right here in the uppermost basket, there was all manner of baked meats for Pharaoh, and the birds did come and eat them out of the basket upon my head. Pharaoh didn't get all that bread because it was supposed to go to Pharaoh. It was supposed to be Pharaoh's bread from his baked meats. But the birds came and ate up all the bread. Meaning where he had all the baked meats, all the bread and whatever else he baked for Pharaoh, it was completely devoured by the fowls of the air. And when it was devoured by these birds, we see that pretty much it's a negative, pessimistic dream that, it was negative and, within 3 days, the 3 white baskets, and then the birds devour and eat up all the bread. Where the chief butler's dream would be prosperity, flourishing, and abundance. This dream symbolizes, when we really look at it, especially from knowing where, Joseph talks about concerning it in the next verse, it's a pessimistic dream of things like famine, lack, and, just not good all around, right? So Genesis chapter 40, verse 18, and Joseph answered and said, "This is the interpretation thereof. The 3 baskets are 3 days." So right there he confirms that that's indeed 3 days, because both of their fates are tied into the 3 days when Pharaoh comes to exercise judgment against them. And the birds part, devouring all the baked meats and that just being taken and gone, it could have been that the baker had stolen from Pharaoh, and Pharaoh found him out and found what was stolen in his chambers. It could be. It doesn't say that here, but it could be that it had something to do with that. And I don't think, even if this is a very tyrant level king, I don't think he's just going to throw somebody in ward, for no reason at all. It would have to be that somebody got greedy and they couldn't figure out which one it was exactly and they stole, or, they not just stole, but pretty much basically whatever it was that they did, it was something that they did. And it could have been that the baker was, they figured out that the baker stole from Pharaoh. when because they did things like they consulted with their like their basically there's people that kind of like diviners. They're would they would try to consult certain spiritual ways to just see if who did what and whatnot, and they would try to it's kind of in a way like casting lots, like where we talked about before, where they would cast lots as a form of divine communication with God, except they're using other means to communicate with their gods, and it's a little different, that they're trying to figure out who did what that way. And it could have been like that, like they could have been consulting their objects that they would consult to see what exactly happened, and stuff like searching the rooms out too and whatnot. And it could have been that they found what was stolen in the baker's room. But right here, Genesis chapter 40, verse 19, yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thy head from off thee, and shall hang thee on a tree, and the birds shall eat the flesh from off thee. So right here, where the birds stole the bread in the dream and ate it out of the 3 baskets on his head, here again, the birds, going from the subconscious to literally the conscious realm, so to speak, shall eat thy flesh from off thee. His fate through the interpretation of the dream was revealed to Joseph. And that is where we're at right there. So right here, Genesis chapter 40, verse 20, and it came to pass the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast unto all his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief butler and of the chief baker among the servants. So it's his birthday, and there's a big feast, but he lifts up the chief butler and the chief baker to execute judgment as the Pharaoh of Egypt. And he wasn't really like a tyrant or anything like that, I would say. He was just kind of a ruler over the nation of Egypt, and he was executing judgment for something that happened. He didn't just, I'm going to throw these guys in prison, I'm just going to be mad at one of them and do what he does next. Like, no, it was just the way that they did stuff. But it doesn't say what he did here in the text. But continuing in Genesis chapter 40, verse 21, and he restored the chief butler onto his butlership again, and he gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand. Just exactly the way Joseph interpreted and predicted his his prophetic dream. So Genesis chapter 40, verse 22, but he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. So everything that he told these 2 men that were so weary that they were just of a sad countenance and very, eating them up, probably stomach all knotted up, just really anxious about it, struggling to understand what they didn't know was a fate dream, but they felt it within themselves that it just had something to do with that, somehow, some way that the dream just meant something. It had meaning, and it did have meaning, just as the scriptures here reveal that they do. through the Word of God, their dreams had meaning, and the King of Dreams, as his nickname is, interpreted them and they came true, And he's not the only one in the Bible that was gifted with dream interpretations. Like, there's also Nebuchadnezzar. He had this dream, and this is his story. I won't get too much into it or anything, but Nebuchadnezzar, he just has this dream that it it wearies him because it is kind of a fate dream, and he calls all of his magicians and astrologers or astrologists and all these people that he would consult to just see if they can interpret the dreams, and people of the Chaldeans and just different people that were there, right? Like within the Babylonian kingdom of that time. And Nebuchadnezzar says this, I need you all to tell me my dream. And they said, well, what is your dream, O king? And he said, I'm not even going to give you the dream. You all need to tell me what my dream was, and that's how I'll know it's real interpretation. So it's something very challenging, and he's going to kill everybody, all the wise men, everybody, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, all of them. Those are the people of God that were there, that were taken out of Judah in the Babylonian captivity, and they were just going to do away with them. He was going to kill them all, and Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego come to the king of Babylon, and they just say, well, give us some time, and God will give you an answer, but just give me a little bit of time. And Nebuchadnezzar grants it before executing them all, and God reveals the dreams onto Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they tell the dream. And then they, above all the people, get, higher honors and exalted, just higher position and status because they could interpret the dream. And we won't get into all of its dream meanings. That's a story for a different day, but I just wanted to make mention here the significance of dreams and their deep meanings and interpretations, and that it's indeed scriptural. It's not a bad thing. It's within the Word of God, so it's something that has meaning and connection with God. And God communicates things through dreams, as it reveals right here. And so Genesis chapter 40, verse 22, but he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. So that comes true, and the baker gets hung for whatever he did do, or maybe even what he didn't do. It doesn't really say what happened and why. It just, the important thing in the story was that Joseph's interpretations came true, and that's what God gave to Moses to share through the text. Because again, this is written as an early time, prophets, because Moses was indeed a prophet and a very special one at that. They don't just see the future. Sometimes God gives them the past too. Like in the purpose for this case of writing all these things that happen in the Genesis and whatnot. Before Moses was even born and really knew everything that happened, God just gave it to him, put it in his head, and he translated it and put it into words on a scroll. And, that scroll was kept, and eventually, like the whole Word of God ends up going from stuff like that into actual Bibles. We get like the King James Version, it comes from King James in England in the 1600s, and pretty much he takes 50 scholars roughly, and each one of them translates the Old Testament from primarily Hebrew, but also a little bit of Aramaic, and the New Testament from all the Greek and whatever other languages it was in, right? And that's how we get the archaic Old English King James version. It's directly translated from that. And before then, we only had like German text and whatnot. And people like the Puritans were literally learning German just so they can read those books, in those days, just not those books, but you know what I mean, the Bible, just so they can read it. They were learning German so they can, get understanding of the scriptures that way. But because of King James and what he did, he makes it easier to get that, to get the, you can just freely read it, and now we have all kinds of versions of the Bible, the New English version and all kinds of other ones. But, pretty much that's what happens here. And we see, to get back where we were, I was just talking about, a little bit of Moses and a little bit of just this and that, because like it all ties in. Moses wrote all of this, and we know it's accurate because it comes from God. And it don't hurt to look at these things like that. Like pretty much all these denominations, or not denominations, but these versions of the Bible, just how we get them, and it starts with pretty much the King James version, But to get back on topic, Genesis chapter 40, verse 23, yet did not the chief butler remember Joseph, but forgot him. So we already talked about that before. He forgot all about Joseph, and he didn't do what he should have done, being grateful to this Semite and this Hebrew man that probably really comforted his soul at this point, because the dream did have meaning, and that's not to say every dream has meaning. There's some dreams that you literally just dream up. I'll go on ahead and say that there, because you just see something in your waking life and then you just kind of dream about it, or whatever it might be, and just different things that influence what you end up dreaming, like that night or later on down the road. You just randomly have a dream of something that came about a few weeks prior or whatever, and it just, you were dreaming about it, But there's the ones that do actually have meaning and that are kind of deep, and they're from God, and Joseph just knew what was what with that. And people, that they had just pretty much where it was gnawing on them and whatnot, so to speak, then pretty much that the dream did have some sort of meaning, and everything's about those symbolisms with that. But yeah, that's where Joseph is at now. Probably spent a few more years in prison. Because again, he don't really get out until he's in his 30s. From 17-year-old young man to a man is that is like in his 30s. It's just like it sucks that he had to spend all that time in captivity, but it all becomes worth it at the end with what happens here shortly. Because what happens here shortly, everything that he went through before was to prepare him for what he was to be. He kept on getting leadership positions, though they were, bad ones and sucky ones, which just best of his situation type stuff. He wasn't making any silver or whatever currency they would get in Egypt from it, right? He was just basically getting fed, and he had less of a burden than everyone else, and that's all he really got from it. But that being said, it all pays off in the end. And he wanted out of prison at that point, but it wasn't God's plan for him right there. And what he wanted was just to be free. But again, before we get to it, I'll say again, God had something better for Joseph. But that's where we stop for tonight, and you all have a blessed day.